To the crisis in Ukraine now. The United States has warned that a Russian invasion of Ukraine would be horrific and result in a significant number of casualties. But Russia denies it's planning an attack. It says the US is ignoring key Russian security concerns. Let's discuss this now with international relations expert Professor John Stremlau from Wits University. Professor, good evening and thank you very much for joining us this evening. So Russia doesn't want NATO expanding further east, which is why it wants the US to guarantee that the Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO. But if it's a defensive alliance with many Eastern European countries already as members, why is Russia so worried about the Ukraine joining?
Well, Annie, thank you for having me. What we don't ask enough, we all talk about Putin, but we don't talk about the self-determination of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people and what they want. They've been independent, member of the UN for as long as South Africa has been a democracy, 30 years or so. They also benefited from the end of the Cold War. And all of the 14 members of the former Eastern Bloc applied for and were granted membership in NATO. It's invited, you have to apply and then you're invited. It's voluntary completely. And Putin is trying to resurrect an ethnic nationalist regime that is essentially hegemonic and controlling. And I think if the people of Ukraine were asked as they rejected the client from Moscow in 2014 with the Orange Revolution here, he invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014, you remember. But there were a lot of retirees from Moscow who enjoy the warm weather in Crimea. Whether they'd want to go back to Russia, I don't know, but it was a popular move then. But it broke the rules that is, we have to have sovereign equality and non-intervention. South Africa has been a big proponent of that position. I hope that South Africa, I know its relations with Moscow are complicated, and there is a history of the ANC working and getting support when the U.S. was allied with the apartheid regime. I know all the history, but I do hope that the South African government can make a plea for self-determination by the Ukrainian people in the spirit that it makes the same plea for Palestinians or for Western Sahara or Sahrawi Republic people. We don't want imposition of unacceptable control by outsiders on peoples who ought to be free.
As much as the relationship between South Africa and Russia is complex, there are also complexities within NATO itself. We know that a number of countries who were previously members of the Soviet Union are members of NATO. We also recently saw Russian President Vladimir Putin speaking to French President Emmanuel Macron, who's keen to de-escalate the situation. If the dialogue between France and Russia is seemingly so comfortable, does that indicate that there may be some dissent with the US's approach to the situation regarding the Ukraine?
I think that there is always a good rule of thumb to keep talking diplomatically, and I think South Africa should encourage that. There are off-ramps into this crisis if Putin wants to take it. We don't know tonight what Putin's ultimate decision will be. I do take a look at the permafrost, which is the frozen ground that allows for the movement of troops and heavy equipment into Ukraine if it's going to be a conventional attack. I suspect that Putin will try to find some way of face saving to avoid getting embroiled in a conflict which could be very difficult for him to win and win outright. And then the domestic opinion within the Soviet Union or within Russia would turn against him. He is a Russian nationalist, and that is a popular position to take with the Russian people, but it's not a popular position to take with the clients and those who've been subjugated by the USSR or by the Imperial Russia historically, like the Ukrainian people. They want their freedom.
What would instability or even outright conflict between Russia and Ukraine mean for not only the security in the European Union and diplomatic relations, but also the gas situation?
Well, we all worry about the price of petroleum, of course, and we also worried about the climate and the impact of petroleum consumption. So there's a lot of dynamics within the energy sector that need to be taken for. But already the U.S. has announced that it would sell off its own stockpile, and it's self-reliant in energy now. It's not an importer anymore. And so it has a good deal of leverage to try to soften the blow. We know that the Germans want the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to be operative and to give them less expensive natural gas. But nevertheless, I think that there is a spirit in the Western European countries right now that, wait a minute, if Putin breaks the rules that have prevailed in international order of sovereign equality and non-aggression against independent states, voluntary association is fine. If Ukraine wants to join Russia and there is a vote to that effect by the Ukrainian people, I'm not going to object, and I don't think the United States would object. But what the United States cannot do is to say that if the Ukrainian people want to apply for membership of European Union or for application for NATO, that it would be considered. My guess is there's enough corruption in Ukraine to discourage any immediate acceptance of that. And I think the U.S. has signaled in every possible way to the Russians that NATO membership for Ukraine or Georgia is just not in the cards.
Professor, thank you so much. I do apologize for interrupting you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for this interview. We do really appreciate your insights.